Hello and welcome to the section 0.4 video on translating verbal expressions. And we will also be covering units of measure in the second half of this video. So let's start off with talking about translating verbal expressions. In translating verbal expressions, what we're doing is taking something that is stated in words and we're turning it into an algebraic expression, okay? So there's a lot of keywords that you need to know to be able to make those translations, okay? So you know and are familiar with the various terms, the various ways that we operate in math. So these are our operations. We have addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So what are some of the words that we use for these? Well, for addition, we say things like the sum of. We also say things like increased by. We may also say plus. That's the most obvious one. When you see the plus sign, you say plus, right? We also say more than. And we're not talking about inequalities in this sense. We're talking like 5 more than a number, okay? 5 more than 6. Well, if we want to know what 5 more than 6 is, we add them. 5 plus 6 is 11. Added to. And the total of. Okay, so there are others, but I just want to kind of give you a good selection of different things that you may come across. All right, for subtraction, instead of saying the sum of, we say the difference of. We may say decreased by. We may say minus. We'll say less than. So for example, 3 less than 4 is 1. All right, so less than. And then we will say subtracted from. All words you may encounter which mean subtraction. Then we get into multiplication. Here we're talking about the product of. Okay, so when you subtract two numbers, you have a difference. When you add two numbers, you get the sum. When you multiply two numbers, you get the product. We may also say multiplied by. We may also say times. And that's just the straight word for that X symbol that you're so used to. And then finally for division, when you divide two numbers, the result is the quotient. So we can say the quotient of. And then divided by. And then the ratio of. Because remember, we talked about how a division problem is a ratio. It's also a fraction. So those are just some of the words to kind of keep in mind. When translating verbal expressions into algebraic expressions, first you want to identify the operation being performed. And you're going to use those key words that you see above as kind of your clue as to what operation is being performed. And then you're going to identify the values for the operations. And then finally determine the order that the operations need to be performed in. So that goes back to PEMDAS, your order of operations. So let's do some examples. So the quotient of 32 and x, we simply mean 32 divided by x. The sum of x and 12 is just x plus 12. 19 decreased by n is 19 minus n. 14 more than the difference of x and y. Okay, this one's a little bit more complicated. So we're adding 14. That's what 14 more means. So we're adding 14, and we're doing 14 more than the difference of x and y. Well, the difference of x and y is x minus y. So we're doing the difference of that, and then we're adding 14 to it. So x minus y in parentheses, and then plus 14. All right, the sum of 6 multiplied by a. So when we do multiplication, we can do 6a. Okay, you can just set them next to each other when you have a number and a variable. And 8 multiplied by b. So we've got 8 multiplied by b, and we're doing the sum of them. So we're adding those together. The quotient of m and 7 decreased by 10. So the quotient of m and 7 is m divided by 7. And then we're decreasing it by 10. So we're subtracting 10 off the end of it. Twice x is just 2 times x, or 2x. Half of u is just u divided by 2. 5 less than 3 times x. 3 times x is 3x, and then we're doing 5 less than that, so we're taking 5 away from it. 7 times a number increased by 4. So we do 7 times a number, so 7 times x, and then we're going to increase it by 4. All right, 6 decreased by 5 times a number. So we're going to do 6 and decrease it by 5 times a number, so 5 times x. And then 3 plus the product of x and 5. So 3 plus the product of x and 5 is 5x. Now let's talk about units of measure. So when we have units of measure, we have ways of measuring distance, time, volume, and mass or weight. So let's talk about some of the different ways we can measure distance. Well, if you've ever been on a road trip, you know that we talk about distance on the road in miles, typically. But we can go smaller than that. You've got yards, like on a football field, and then you have feet, and you have inches. This is all called imperial units. There's also metric units, and those are things such as kilometers, meters, and centimeters. And then you've got others like millimeters and things like that, okay? Notice that each of these ends in the word meters. Metric units work the same way as you go to volume and mass and weight. So let's skip time for a second. In volume, you can have liters. You can also have kiloliters. You can also have centiliters, although you don't typically hear those measurements as much as maybe milliliters. You hear milliliters more. And then in grams, that's your unit, metric unit for mass. You can have kilograms. You can have centigrams, or you would probably more so hear milligrams, which is a little bit smaller than centigrams. So since we're over at volume and mass and weight, let's talk about the imperial units. For volume, imperial units include gallons. You hear about that on the road too, getting gallons of gas, right? Then you have quarts. You have cups. You can even have teaspoons and tablespoons, things like that. For mass and weight, you step on a scale, you typically talk about how many pounds you weigh. And a unit below that is ounces. All right, let's talk about time. We've got all kinds of ways to talk about time. Let's start with the smallest. Okay, all of these we went from big to small. Let's start from the smallest and go up. So you have seconds, and then above that you have minutes, and above that you have hours, and then 24 hours in a day, and then 7 days in a week. There's 52 weeks in a year. There's 10 years in a decade. There are 10 decades or 100 years in a century. And then you have a millennium, which is 1,000 years. And I'm going to check on the spelling of that. And yes, the spelling of millennium does have 2 L's. And I'm going to check one more time. Millennium is definitely a tricky word to spell. And then you have E and then 2 N's. So there you go. There's the correct spelling for millennium. All right, so now that we have a good mix of units and measures, let's talk about the most appropriate unit of measure to use for the following situations. So the distance between 2 cities, you would most likely use miles for that. You could also use kilometers. For a height of a person, typically we measure the height of a person in feet. The weight of an adult, we're going to most typically talk about pounds. For the time to drive across the United States, it does take quite a bit of time to drive across the US, so I would probably measure that in days. It takes about 3 to 4 days to drive across the country. For the size of a piece of paper, we typically say inches. Standard piece of paper is 8.5 by 11 inches. The amount of water used to take a shower, I would say gallons for that. On average, it takes about 9 gallons of water for a typical 10-minute shower. The area of a football field, we usually talk about that in yards, but not just yards, but square yards, okay? So you can put the little 2 up there like that, or we could just say the word square yards, because you have to multiply the length and the width. So yards times yards gives us square yards. And then finally, the amount of liquid cough syrup in a single dose. You could say a teaspoon, but I would probably go milliliters. And you've measured in milliliters most likely if you've ever used one of those little cups to measure your dose of medicine. All right, so that does it for this section of notes. Pretty short section on translating verbal expressions and units of measure. Now that we've talked a little bit about units of measure, the next section in point 5, we're going to talk about dimensional analysis. So we'll be using some of these units a little bit more in depth in the next section.